Love staying informed? Subscribe now and get unlimited access to local news, weather, and sports for just 99 cents a month for your first 3 months at inforum.news/join. Read every story, listen to every podcast, and download the apps that keep you informed and on the go 24 hours a day. So head to inforum.news/join right now to subscribe. What are you waiting for? Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month at inforum.news/join.
You're listening to Plain Talk, the voice of North Dakota politics. I'm your host, Rob Port. If I sound distracted, it's because I've been busy covering this story all morning. I'm joined by my co-host, Chad Oban.
He's right of center, I'm left of center, both sides of the political spectrum.
I think it's cathartic. I think it's a necessary and proper debate. I'm glad we're having it.
And honestly, we have to do better.
Okay, I don't know why I'm getting blamed for this, right? Today we're going to talk about Measure 2. What is Measure 2? Well, it seeks to reform North Dakota's initiated measure process, and it makes some significant changes, particularly for the constitutional amendment process. It raises the number of signatures required for constitutional amendments. It also states the constitutional amendments have to be approved on the statewide ballot twice, once on the June primary ballot and once on the November general election ballot. And then for all ballot measure processes, it says that people who are not North Dakota residents cannot collect signatures. Now, one of the proponents of this legislation joins us on this show. It's State Senator Jana Myrdal. She's a Republican. She's from the Grafton area, the northeast part of the state. She's going to be giving the argument for this. And Ellie Shockley, who's a columnist with the Bismarck Tribune, she's going to be giving the other side of the debate. And Chad and I are actually divided on this as well. I don't like the initiated measure process really at all. I mean, the changes that I would make would be if I would keep it at all, and I'm not so sure I wouldn't take this part of our state constitution, ball it up, and throw it in the garbage. But that's my view. Chad likes this. But I think at the very least, maybe we can all agree that there needs to be some changes, just maybe not Measure 2. I don't know. Let's get into it. Senator, tell us, first of all, why? Why did you back this measure? And actually, to be clear, this made it to the statewide ballot through the legislature. The legislature approved a constitutional resolution that then places it on the statewide ballot to be approved by the voters. That's North Dakota's process. Any constitutional amendment, ultimately, whether it's initiated by the legislature or through the petitioning process, has to be approved on the ballot by the voters. Jana, why'd you support this?
Well, Rob, thank you for having me on, and Chad. I've been concerned about this process for probably about a decade. And regardless, let's take away even the issues that we voted on in the last decade as far as these constitutional measures. I've said over and over again that none of the ones that we voted on so far were like the people of North Dakota rising up from the grassroots against the severe injustice in our Constitution, right? They've been all initiated from out-of-state millionaires or million-dollar activists. And so I've been concerned that our Constitution basically stands naked on Main Street, right? And it's a game. It's a dark game. And you can sit in California or New York or Oregon or whatever, liberal states, and go, heck, how much did it cost to change criminal law in North Dakota? And you take a dart and you attach $1 million or whatever to it, metaphorically, and you change it. And there's been no transparency, Rob. And I agree with you in your column. There's no transparency. We live in a, hopefully, constitutional republic where it's we the people. And by we the people, I mean you elect your representatives. That's what the Founding Fathers said. Elect them to go and govern, whether it's in D.C. or on the state level. And you can fire them or hire them at will at the election ballot box, right? And I believe in transparency. And none of the measures that I've seen in the last decade here in North Dakota have had transparency. You should throw a nice word on like ethics, right? Who doesn't like ethics? Well, I do. Do I like how the ethics measure was passed and what came out of it? No. Do you want pink roses on Valentine's Day? Yes, of course I do. But what I'm saying is all these cute kind of hip words we throw on the Constitution, and it's easy to do. And our founding fathers made it very difficult to change the national Constitution. So I think we should make it more difficult and have a process so we have an open debate. And that's the attempt here. It isn't as strong as I wanted it to, and I didn't get that support through the legislative process, but this one did, and it's the least we can do to protect our Constitution.
So, Senator Myrdal, thanks for coming on to talk about this. And Rob said that I've actually evolved a little bit on wanting to maybe make it a little tighter and harder to change the Constitution based on the last 6 months of my life dealing with Measure 4, which is on the ballot. But I think even if you support the idea of making it more difficult to change the Constitution, that doesn't necessarily mean that this is the right policy. It's sort of like you're mad at property taxes. That doesn't mean we should necessarily abolish them. So from my perspective, this thing does three things. Single subject goes from 4% to 5% in terms of the amount of signatures. And then, like Rob said, it has to pass both the primary and general election. I actually don't have a problem with going to 4 to 5%, making it a little bit more difficult. But I am a little concerned about the single subject and also the primary in general. So, one thing on the single subject, I can't get over the irony of the fact that this measure has three major provisions while saying we should only vote on a single subject constitutional measure. Can you talk a little bit about the fact that this measure that you're asking people to support would be illegal in the future if this measure were to pass?
Well, I appreciate that, Chad, and I've been asked that question. I think it's still a single subject. We're talking about constitutional measures, and that's the subject of this measure, right? So I just respectfully disagree that it's got different subjects. I think we're talking about the same subject. I think we're talking about protecting the Constitution. Honestly, and
one distinction on this. A while ago, we had a proposal that would have made several changes to the way we vote, and it would have changed everything from extending the ballot period for sending absentee ballots to people deployed overseas. It covered a lot of different, because it covered primaries, it covered how we vote, it covered, candidates. That to me was multiple subjects. But this, where it's like we're talking with the same process, which is initiated measures for the ballot, that does seem single subject.
Yeah.
I guess that's the distinction.
Well, Robert, it seems like we're going to be in court a lot over that moving forward, right?
Well, and that's not the experience in other states, right? Go ahead, Yana.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I think we're in court over a lot of things all the time, no matter what. I'm personally in the court these days. So, as frivolous and crazy as that is, and it's actually crazy, but talk for another day. But I just have to respectfully disagree with you, Chad. I think it is a single subject. And I will be the first one to say, I wish this measure was stronger. And if you look at the original bill that I put in, that was, by the way, co-signed by both the leaders in both chambers, because we have that same concern. I wish, and I hope with a new governor coming in, which I assume, respectfully again, will be Kelly Armstrong, but he talks transparency too. There is no transparency going on with these measures. We just throw them on. I've had bills before that put the whole language on, that counties don't want that, the ballot becomes too big. So all I'm saying is, if we have it in the primary and the general election, at least then we maybe can have some debate. Maybe we can get out there and actually people know what they're voting for. As an example, and it doesn't affect me personally because I'm too old, but term limits, I haven't met one constituent yet in my district that didn't think they were voting term limit for Congress. And I think it's on us as lawmakers, as public servants, and the media like you, to make sure we have open debate. Why not take the constitutional measures through the legislative process? Let's say we change it someday and say, let's get through the legislative process, let's make sausage out of it, let's battle back and forth, open debates, and still it goes to the people. Let's say the lawmakers don't even get to vote on it, but we get to have the opportunity to figure out what is this all about. And I'm conservative, Chad, but the property tax measure is a sledgehammer. I've said that in the media instead of a scalpel. And it's a reactionary thing. And who doesn't want to say yes to not paying taxes? Again, it's a talking point, but it has massive consequences down into special rural areas. So we are not having an open debate unless you join the proponent and an opponent on Facebook. There's no open, transparent debate. about changing the Constitution. I think that is a very dangerous trajectory, and to me, it goes against a constitutional republic where we vote at the ballot or we fire people at the ballot, if that be it, which is the American right for everyone to do.
Jana, one thing, one problem that you have said that you want to solve and that I believe does need to be solved is the idea of the rich, sort of special interests or deep-pocketed activist individuals who can just kind of pay their way onto the ballot. They can hire a whole bunch of signature collectors. Basically, if you have $500,000 to pay temp workers, you can put your issue on the ballot. I understand that. But the idea is, and the argument that many people make is, we've gotten away from this idea of, citizen activists and volunteers going out there and having this sort of popular uprising versus paid professionals just using this mechanism. But doesn't raising the limits, that seems to make it, somebody who's got a $500,000 or millions of dollars to throw at one of these campaigns, they could collect another, several thousand signatures if they need to. They can, pay to campaign on both the primary and November ballot, in terms of, doing advertising or what have you. Those parts of the measure doesn't really address that problem, does it?
No, I think originally, Rob, a lot of the original language addressed it, but again, we went through the session with this measure, right? This is not initiated. This went through the process and got referred, and there were too many lawmakers, honestly, that were scared to death of this, scared to death of standing for our Constitution, scared that, oh my gosh, like they're blaming me now, and if people know me, they know it's not true, but, she's trying to take the right away from the people. She's been there too long. She's one of those lawmakers now, which is absolutely false. It's absolutely false, but so many lawmakers are scared of that. And we had stronger provisions in there, Rob, and I wish it was stronger because I agree with you. Again, I've said it, and I said it at the chamber the other day, let's talk about nudity, and I got a lot of attention for that. But because our Constitution literally stands nude and naked on demers, right? And you just throw a dart on it from out of state. And so this is a beginning of trying to limit that. I don't think the measure is strong enough. And yet I have people coming after me today that think it's too strong and takes the right away from the people and it's ambiguous. That's become media's number one issue now. Everything is ambiguous. It's ambiguous. Well, at least it's gone through the open process of the lawmaking process, and we do the best we can for the people in North Dakota. But yeah, I agree with you. It should be stronger. And I think we are going further and further and further away from a constitutional republic where we elect our neighbors to serve, whether it's in the county or city or lawmakers or in Congress. We're going further and further away from that. And this is one way to try to stop that and get back to the fundamentals of the country.
So one of the other things I want to talk about is the difference in which this measure would treat the citizens versus the legislature. Citizens initiated measure, constitutional initiated measure would have to go through the primary and general. On the other hand, if it was initiated by the legislature, it would just have to go, I think just to the general election. You'd said that, the legislature goes through this process and it's an open process. Yes, it's an open process that about 14 people pay attention to that in the state capitol. Aren't you taking away the citizens' rights and sort of giving even more power to the legislature to change the Constitution? And why treat the legislative initiated constitutional measure different than the citizens' constitutional measure?
Well, I think the simple answer, Chad, is, and again, I feel your pain in the questions because I agree with you, but I think the difference is, again, that process of 4 months of the media covering it, the legislators being in totally open, transparent process. The fact that you say, quote unquote, 14 people pay attention, it's sad to me, but at least that leaves it then open. You have that open transparency. You have the opportunity to testify. You have the opportunity to question it or to battle with it, if you will, or to write letters to the editor. In the process now, with the constitutional measure initiated, it doesn't come from the grassroots. I wish it did, but it doesn't. I think it just comes from like you said, deep-pocketed people. So I think there's a difference. I'm not trying to treat legislators differently at all. And originally, like I said, it was much stronger. It was much better than it is now. But I'm still so passionate about protecting our Constitution. I'm a grassroots activist myself, right? I used to be for decades on life issue and other issues. And by the way, full transparency, because my opponent might say this later, oh, Myrdal should put this on because she's afraid of an abortion measure next 2026 or whatever. That didn't even cross my mind, honestly. Didn't even cross my mind until I saw it in the media, and I go, yeah, I can see why they say that, but that is not why I did this. I think I led a measure in 2014. It was not initiated. It was a human life amendment. You guys remember it. We lost. And we lost fair and square. The people said, no, I get that. But it was a referred. It was battled out in the session, the language before it got to the people so they have knowledge of it. It's incumbent on all citizens, right, to be knowledgeable about what they're voting on. But it's hard to be knowledgeable when you just get a buzzword like ethics or term limits or no more taxes or whatever, and you don't know the rest of the measure and how it affects your life. I think it's just unfair to the people in North Dakota, and that's just where I found again.
I wanted to respond to something Chad said, because we've reached a weird crossroads where it falls to me to defend the engagement of the public. But the legislative process, particularly in this era where we have video available, I mean, there are times, depending on the subject or which hearing or whatever we're talking about, there are sometimes hundreds of people will show up to testify on an issue at a committee hearing.
Oh, yeah.
And if you watch the video stats, hundreds of people can be watching one of these committee hearings. Now, not everyone. I mean, most of them, I would argue, are probably not. But when there's a subject that the public's interested in, they do tune in, and they are there. And so there are people that pay attention to that process.
Well, Rob, now I'm going to have to, I mean, usually it's you saying, these people aren't educated enough. But in all seriousness, I mean, I pay very close attention to the legislature as part of my job. I didn't know what came out of the legislature on Measure 2, right, until I saw the ballot language. So again, I think we can say that the process is open and 100 people are paying attention. It's thousands of bills going on there.
Oh, yeah.
So that's,
Well, that's fair. Although in reverting back to my traditional mode, I would argue if we polled the public right now and asked them, what is Measure 2?
Agreed.
Or what is Measure 4, which was initiated through the petitioning process, how many of them could accurately describe it?
I think that's fair.
Which is part, I mean, and Yana, I guess that speaks to one of my problems with the initiated measure process. I mean, it goes certainly beyond the scope of your amendment, because your amendment certainly preserves that process. But one of the things that really bothers me is, at least the legislative process, it is a scheduled opportunity for engaged, interested members of the public, elected lawmakers, some of whom have a lot of experience, most of whom I would argue have a lot of experience in government, people who work in the various levels of government, people who are lobbyists or represent interests, who have expert knowledge in different industries. It's a place for them to all come in a process that is well established and very transparent for them to engage in. We don't have that when we put an issue on the ballot. Yeah. Somebody who doesn't even necessarily need to be a lawyer can draft it. If they can get enough signatures, it's on the ballot. And there really is no structure to the debate we have about it. Sometimes these ballot measures pass with very little debate at all. I would argue that the age limit measure that just passed earlier this year sailed through with very little scrutiny and very little debate, despite, I wrote about it and talked about it, but I don't know that there was a lot of interest from the general public in it. We approved it. We have it now, and I don't know what the ramifications are for that. So I guess speak to that.
And Rob, you got to realize this is constitutional change. That's my big heartburn here, right? Like I tell people, and people are more engaged than ever, and I love that. People are much more in touch with their elected officials. I would say since COVID, if not before, and I love that. I love people showing up in committee. I love having the hallway full, whether it's opponents to what I believe in or not. I don't care. I love that open debate. I grew up with that. My dad, encouraged that in our family, because they went through World War II where they weren't able to say anything, right? So we were just push, open debate. Don't make it personal, and I think that's important. But this is constitutional change. This isn't just changing the law or country code so that we can, work on it, see what actually works for the people in North Dakota. This is permanent. You can't get these overturned again. That never happens. And so that's what I'm saying. If you're going to remodel your bathroom, you don't tear your house down. You just work on the bathroom, right? Here we are actually putting fundamentals in that are the fundamental four cornerstones of our society. It's going to affect absolutely everybody. Like term limits, like taxes, like ethics, like Marty's law, you name it, like term, age limits or whatever. And we're not actually having the opportunity to debate if they're constitutional in and of themselves. I think there's provisions in the term limit one that is not constitutional. Actually, it could be challenged in court. Again, this is not personal to me because I'm too old to care about that, but there are huge, huge changes in our Constitution. I think the Founding Fathers did not intend for that. Look how hard it is. They've been trying for, 20 years now to have a convention in the states. They can't get it done. It should be that hard to change the Constitution. And on the end of it, Rob, what's frustrating to me, maybe personally, because I'm just a farmer's wife and an immigrant, and yes, I'm a state senator for a while, but is that the mistrust in lawmakers right now because of, a few bad apples, and they're bad. It's sad to me because I think Democrats, and I'll say that to Chad too, who's his wife I served with, I thought she served her district well. Her and I disagreed, but I would say 75 to 80% of lawmakers out there are trying to do the best they can for the state of North Dakota. And yet we bring all wiped out. Oh, you're just trying to take over. Are you trying to do this? There's something mischievous, and I think your wife Erin spoke to that too. And so, we're in a bad spot, and people can take advantage of that bad spot and change our Constitution with severe consequences. And I think that's a scary trajectory.
Senator Myrdal, I actually tend to agree with the idea of out-of-state interests coming in and dumping a bunch of money to change the Constitution, and that is not good. We see it time and time again from the right and the left. What I'm not convinced of is that this measure makes it better. If that's the problem we're trying to solve, then I think that's a noble thing to try to solve. Can you just talk about, from your perspective, how would this measure make it so it's more difficult for well-funded out-of-state interests to change the Constitution?
Well, a couple of things. I think a single subject keeps activists or political activists or big money people for sneaking things in that has nothing to do with the actual core subject of what people are voting on. Secondly, I think by upping it to 5%, it should be even more probably. It's a little harder lift instead of just standing outside of hockey games or football games and throw out a buzzword when people have had a good time and been drinking and get them to sign something. I had stronger provisions in it, but again, they were debated and taken out. As far as the primary and the general, I think it's just to give it, because it's constitutional, not just entry code, it's to give it more scrutiny, make sure people know, because I think the people in North Dakota are smart, they're educated, but how can you vote on something when you don't know the facts, when you haven't heard the debate, when you don't know the rest of the language, which is not on the ballot? And so at least that will give it two opportunities for open debate instead of just once.
Let me ask you, why? Because this isn't a single. Because I do agree with you. I think this is a single issue. Although, that becomes so vague. Chad's right. We're probably, if this were to pass, we would probably end up in litigation over what single issue means. But let me ask you this. It seems one of the struggles that we have when the legislatures tried to reform this process, and people come out of the woodwork and say, oh, they're trying to take power away from the people. Why not focus on some like the low-hanging fruit of this? Like I think most North Dakotans, if you just gave them a straight up or down vote on should people who are not North Dakota residents be allowed to collect signatures to put an issue on the ballot, I think most people would agree. It's very simple. And I think most people, why not go that route? And understanding it would take longer, but I feel like if we started addressing the singular problems within this issue, that might be a better approach. Why not take that approach?
Well, that was one of the issues that we debated during the session, and I agree with you. Again, I think this measure is a low hanging fruit. To be honest with you, and I don't have the original language in front of me as we speak, but it was much more than that. And I agree with you. I think out-of-staters should not be able to be part of changing the Constitution of North Dakota, whether it be signatures or gathering signatures or paying for gathering of those signatures. So some of that is covered here, but I agree with you. This should be stronger, Rob. This is what we were able to get out of open debate and transparency during the session, and this is what was the end product. And people are just going to have to take it for what it is. And honestly, it is to protect the people's voice in North Dakota. It's not the opposite that I'm being accused of. I think people who know me know that. But, politics are politics, and people are going to turn this around and say it's ambiguous, it's going to go to court. Most of our laws can be challenged. Well, all of our laws can be challenged in court. I mean, that's why we have a Attorney General. And the Secretary of State has the authority, or should have it, to authorize what goes on a ballot or not according to the law that directs them, even though some of that has been often taken away, I think. So So, yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Rob. It could be easier to go that route, but this is what we have before us, and I hope people see it for what it is.
So one of the things that came up last week that I hadn't thought about until Bob Harms brought it up when we're discussing Measure 4, and even removing Measure 4 from the conversation. If something is voted on by the people that ends up being crazy or unintended consequences or those kind of things, wouldn't passing Measure 2 make it more difficult to fix those things by making it more difficult to change the Constitution? Are there unintended consequences of making it more difficult to change the Constitution if something like Measure 4 were to pass?
I don't think so. I don't think so, because I think it should be difficult. I think it should be difficult to put it in the Constitution, and I think it should be difficult to change it as well, right? It's the same argument to me. Right now, it's already very difficult to change it. I mean, I can't think of in my lifetime that we've changed or taken something out. Actually, Measure 1 is probably going to do it. We're just correcting some language that has to be legally corrected. But it's constitutional, right? So it has to be a vote of the people. So, no, it's not a perfect system on any level, Chad, and I agree with you. I disagree with Harm, but actually, at the chamber debate I had with him, he thinks this is way too weak. It should be a ton stronger. That was his kind of argument. So I didn't know he was out there arguing against Measure 4 as well. But no, I think making it harder to put it on the Constitution, or on the ballot, and make a constitutional change at the beginning. Again, look at what term limits said. It literally says in language, lawmakers can't touch it, can't debate it, can't change it, which is interesting in and of itself. But I'm just concerned that we're going around about a constitutional republic, which is the country I migrated to, right? It's a fantastic system that the founding fathers set up. And whether it's a ballot from out-of-state initiative that has not been debated to change the constitution of a state, or whether it's the direct order from the president without going through anything like we see with a pen and a phone call, I think we're on the wrong trajectory, and I think we are not appreciating the system that we live in and how it was set up. And so maybe that's a 30,000-foot view, but so we are going that direction where we're not trusting our system anymore.
Well, we're going to let you go in, and the scenario that Bob's brought up, Bob Harms, is really kind of a one-off thing. I mean, we're talking about two constitutional amendments that would pass at the same time, one dealing with property taxes, and the other one changing the process by which we could potentially amend the Constitution. So it's kind of it's not an invalid point, but it's a fleeting one, I guess, just kind of in this moment. It's unusual. Yana, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, Yana.
Yeah, thank you, both of you. Have a great day.
The cold cases you see at The Vault have captivated readers across our region for years. At The Vault Podcast, our team of professional reporters takes you further into those stories with new interviews from family members, investigators, and experts. Check out The Vault at inforum.com/The Vault and subscribe to The Vault wherever you find your podcasts.
Well, now for the other part of this debate, of course, we're talking about Measure 2, which would amend the state constitution in all the ways we just described in the previous segment. We heard Senator Myrdal. She was one of the lawmakers who backed this. Now we're going to hear from Ellie Shockley. She is a columnist for the Bismarck Tribune. She's very active politically, and she has some opinions about Measure 2. And I guess that's my first question, Ellie, is why not pass Measure 2?
I think Measure 2 directly takes power from the people, and because power is relative, it ends up giving more power to politicians. There's a couple parts of it that are particularly egregious. So first of all, expecting people to vote twice to pass a ballot measure is elite and out of touch. I think a lot of times people who are very plugged into politics think it's really easy to stay on top of all political happenings and elections and all the issues that are coming forward, and expecting people to vote twice on an issue when they have extremely busy lives. Ordinary people have a lot going on. They have jobs, they have children, they have elder care, they may have their own health issues. It's disrespectful to expect people to have to vote twice on an issue. It's like condescending, like, oh, we didn't believe you the first time, now you have to vote again. The other component that I find the most egregious is the single subject requirement that it would require of measures. And I know that it can kind of sound good on the surface, but I think when we dig a little deeper, it's very problematic. We have every reason to suspect that it would not be applied equally, that it would be an opportunity for unfairness. There's these researchers, Matsusaka and Hazen, have done empirical research on this issue, and they do find that decision makers' own views of measures influence whether they enforce a single subject rule on it or not. And we're not special. We have the same problem. I say that North Dakotans are perfectly capable of rejecting measures they don't like. And if a measure is particularly convoluted, they're going to know and they're going to throw it out. And so I just think we can just let measures fail. It's okay. If they're not, even though they gathered the signatures, if they're actually not that high quality, the people are perfectly good at filtering out what they consider nonsense. And we don't need this risk of bias for the enforcement of single subject rule.
Ellie, can you talk a little bit about what is in the measure in terms of single subject? We just had a conversation with Senator Murdahl, and I made the case that I don't think this provision would make it through the test of single subject because there's 3 different major provisions. Others disagreed with me. But can you talk about if this measure, if this were to pass, this constitutional measure were to pass, what would be the process for single subject? Who would make that determination? Would it go to the courts or how would that work?
My understanding is that it would begin with the Secretary of State, and then the Attorney General would be brought in as necessary. But to be honest with you, I actually don't think I'm totally clear on all the process and the finer details. I just think should this pass, there's actually a lot to hammer out, and that actually concerns me. So I think that I understand we shouldn't write constitutional law to be extremely detailed, that we take that and that we build, statutory code from that. But I think that there's a lot of room for interpretation. And so I think for me, the vagueness is part of the concern. So yeah, I'm not totally sure exactly how it would play out. And that's part of the problem for me.
Ellie, I got to tell you, I'm struggling with some of the language you're using. I agree with you on the vagueness part, but you just went through, you called this elite and out of touch. You called it condescending. You called it disrespectful. And I guess what I'm struggling with is I don't know that Measure 2 is the right solution to the problem, but I have a real problem with defending this process as some pure and distilled expression of the public's will when so many of the ballot measures that have passed recently have been funded by billionaires in California, which was Marzy's law, or in Pennsylvania, which was the term limits and the age limits law, or in all sorts of like Berkeley and Los Angeles and all sorts of Hollywood celebrities who teamed up and funded Represent.us that backed the ethics measure. I mean, yes, the North Dakota voters ultimately said yes to this, but do you not see any validity in people saying maybe voters need a longer runway because they are busy to consider this? Maybe we don't need temp workers from Minnesota and South Dakota being paid to come into North Dakota and collect signatures. Maybe we don't need a process where anybody who has $500,000 to pay signature collectors can put whatever issue they want on the ballot. Is that elite and condescending and disrespectful?
I'm receptive to some ways of thinking of a longer runway. I just don't think this is the way to do it. I think there's a lot of room for more.
Okay, but am I an elitist and am I condescending and disrespectful for having these concerns?
I would say that you are among the people who understand politics very deeply and very easily, and maybe aren't aware of how difficult it is to understand and keep up and feel confident in knowing how to vote for a lot of ordinary people whose jobs take their attention elsewhere.
Okay, but we're asking them to show up at 2 statewide elections. They should be voting there anyway. Why aren't they voting in the primary? I mean, we talk about that being a problem, the low turnout at some point, this is a participatory democracy. We're asking people to participate. I don't think that's unreasonable or elitist.
I think what's unintentionally elitist, but elitist nonetheless, is not understanding why and when turnout is poor and who it's poor among. Turnout is really high among people of a certain socioeconomic status and age group, people who really have that stability and opportunity. It's lower. I mean, they're just socio-demographic factors that are very tightly linked to poor turnout. And there's just more that can be done. And we do have, a lot less turnout in June elections and November elections. So part of that is the salience of presidential elections. So we have more turnout in presidential years than in interim election years. And a part of that is the issues and the candidates reaching people. But the amount of people I've had to coach on voting and just going to the polls and understanding measures, understanding candidates, these are intelligent people. They're just busy and overwhelmed, and they're just not, intellectually political insiders. And I'm coaching them.
Isn't that an argument against? I mean, because the initiated measure process is premised on the idea that the people that you said are too busy to pay attention should be deciding these very complicated, at times very complicated ballot measures and policy proposals at the ballot box.
Yes, and I think it's just clear in our state constitution that's how it works. I mean, we may disagree on this, but there is a kind of sacredness to self-governance. And I think Article 3, the vibe, the language in Article 3 makes it very clear that that's where the legitimacy of government comes. It's from the people. And we meet people where they're at. And there's a lot more we can do with civic education. I mean, we might learn from some other states that do a little bit more to raise awareness. I think that, conversations like these are sometimes all people get. And, thank God we have them. But I think there's a lot more that we can do to meet people where they're at and educate them. And so a longer runway, I could imagine ways to do that. Just more education, investing. This may cost money. Sometimes good policy costs money. But having people more brought into the fold, there could be even high school curriculum that is more wrapped up in understanding civic engagement. I mean, there's just so many ways to meet people where they're at, as they are the source of all political legitimacy and power in the state. And so we are beholden to them. We are them as well. I think that it's elitist to think, let's not meet people where they're at. Let's not educate them more. Let's just constrain their power and their vote and make them vote twice because we don't trust them the first time. But I also want to say, I think it's a fair conversation to talk about campaign finance, but there's just absolutely no reason whatsoever to separate out ballot measures from candidates. And so I think, to me, it's just kind of weird that we get so focused on outside influence in both the content and funding of measures, but we don't have that exact same conversation at the same time about it with candidates. So, I mean, how many bills do we get that come from ALEC, this outside organization? Our candidates are funded from all different kinds of entities. So I think a serious discussion of campaign finance is inclusive of all these different kinds of campaigns. And I think that's a conversation worth having. It's just not captured in this measure.
So, Ellie, one of the things that I'm troubled by with the measure is the idea that the citizens would have to put the vote to the people twice, but if something is initiated by the legislature, it only has to be passed once. Senator Myrdal basically said, hey, listen, once it goes through the legislative process, that's an open process. That's where people can participate. So it's different than a citizen. What would you say to that? I mean, treating citizens different than the legislature.
Yeah, I'm not cool with that at all. And it does seem to, increase that power imbalance between the people and the legislature, that it's easier for them to pass their measures than it is for us to pass ours. I do think that there's a lot of resources available during legislative session that ordinary citizens do not have access to. Ordinary citizens do not have legislative counsel. They do not have time off dedicated. They do not have lunches covered. They don't have the institutional and financial infrastructure to craft legislation. And so I think it's kind of rich to act like that, that process is so great and people need more barriers. It's like that process is really well structured in an advantaged way. People don't have access to those resources. And so I think just increasing the inequality between these two methods is just really unfair and just sort of not recognizing the differences between being a legislator and being a citizen.
Yeah, I don't agree with that at all. I think I look at the legislative process and I don't think the problem, I think the problem is that people aren't showing up for it. And again, I realize that this is a very heterodox opinion. In politics, we don't like to blame the voters for things, right? Because our political system essentially at the end of the day revolves around popularity, and you don't become very popular by telling the voters that they're not showing up and they're not doing their jobs. But yet that's the reality. It's a lot of them are not. It's very easy to show up at the legislature. It's very easy to sit in your living room at 2 o'clock in the morning and access the video of the committee hearings and the legislative hearings and scroll through all the submitted testimony. That is sitting there, available, easy for anybody to access. So this idea that it's some elitist thing or special thing that only certain people can engage in is not reality, Ellie, and I think you know that.
I wouldn't agree that it's easy. I would say that it's feasible. I would say that it's an option, especially post-COVID. It's actually really great that this is something people can do, but it's not really that easy. It's not that easy to navigate the legislative website and I think that I agree that there's more we can do to foster engagement. And I think we need a cultural shift. And this is not unique to North Dakota. This is, in America, we need a cultural shift of that level of engagement. And I think we do it better in North Dakota than a lot of other places because that proximity of us to our government. I've lived other places and I've never actually been this engaged because engagement's more normal here, but we have a lot of room to grow. I think it seems sort of punitive to see people as not measuring up in their level of engagement and saying, fine, we're going to make things harder for you. When I think the more appropriate response, and the one that's more consistent with the spirit of our state constitution, is to focus on education and engagement, focus on it from a young age, make participation more normal. There's just so many things we can do culturally and institutionally to make voters rise to the occasion. I just think, finding ways to punish them just because they're not rising to the occasion at the level we want right now is inappropriate.
I don't agree with the characterization that this is punishment, but let me ask you about something you said. You talked about this direct democracy being sort of sacred. And I don't think that's true at all. In fact, in the American tradition, we put in several safeguards against direct democracy. We don't popularly elect our United States presidents. We didn't popularly elect the United States Senate at the beginning. There really was only one part of our federal government that was popularly elected. This idea of people legislating at the ballot box is a construct of the states. And while I certainly support states' rights under the 10th Amendment, this idea that it's sacred, I think, is not. It's out of step with the American tradition of governance, where we are a republic, and in fact, we have a lot to fear from the whims of the mob and direct democracy.
I think it's totally okay if something is a very strong value in North Dakota that isn't necessarily the case on the national scale. It's okay for us to be our own flavor, to have our own priorities. When I say sacred, I mean, in this context, I really am talking about our own state. And I think it's just okay to not look like everyone else. And it has been, we just have different cultures and priorities out here. It's part of the history. And I think that's okay. And I also think that while the mob mentality can be problematic, I really haven't been seeing any major human rights violations coming out of the measures that are being passed by the people. I think that we have more problematic legislation coming from our legislature. And so the idea that we have this just risk of just bigoted nonsense from the people, when actually if you study the kinds of proposals that are passing from the people versus the legislature, I think the real threat comes from the legislature.
Yeah.
So I think it's okay if, our vibe is a little different than the average national approach to this.
The same legislators that our brilliant electorate elects.
Rob, so I would just, first of all, say I think this may be too strong a word. It's a little delusional to think that the average citizen knows how to access this stuff and participate and influence elected officials who are making these decisions.
Only for lack of trying. I mean, it takes effort to ride a bicycle.
There are people out there.
It takes effort to learn how to ride a bicycle too.
Rob, you've talked a lot during this part of the interview, so I'm going to talk for a little bit now, not to go all Kamala Harris on you. But you think the people who are dropping their kids off at soccer practice, getting them to school, going to work an hourly wage, are like, well, now what I should do is I should take a few hours to go up to the Capitol to talk to a bunch of people who don't want to hear my opinion because it's different than theirs. And somehow that is an open process that makes citizens feel heard.
You engage.
Maybe you've been in the majority for too long, Rob.
Or maybe, I mean, but the counterpoint to that is we're also asking those same busy people to sit down and read through a 30 or 40 page policy proposal that has been subjected to no open hearings, that has been subjected to no scrutiny from two chambers of elected officials, and they're somehow supposed to understand what at times is very complex legal language, and sit down and then make that in, and then decide and put that in the state constitution. At the ballot
box. A lot more people listening to this podcast than that listen to a legislative hearing. So if you want to talk about an open hearing about something, this is it.
It's not my fault that the people aren't showing up to pay attention to their government.
At corners, Rob, a normal person can't go to the Capitol at 10 o'clock in the morning and take time off from work and do all those things. Great,
but they can stream up.
Listen, can I just finish one thought in this podcast, please? If they're watching the thing at 2 o'clock in the morning, they're not influencing the outcome. They're aware of what's happening up there, but they're not involved in influencing the outcome.
If I'm sounding a little upset, it's because I am sick to death of being called condescending and disrespectful for having real concerns. And maybe, Ellie, that's a question for you. Do you not see any problems with the status quo? Do you not see any problems with California billionaires coming in and putting their hobby horses in our state constitution or paying signature collectors? You don't have any problem with any of this?
I don't really, but I am open-minded to hearing what ordinary people feel. So there are some times where I don't take a hard stance because I'm willing to learn more before I have that stance. I currently don't see this as a problem because people are ultimately North Dakotans are voting, and they're voting based on their values, and they do vote no sometimes. I mean, things fail. And so I think that I'm not just going to buy that there's inherently a problem. And I think just because people are passing measures that elites don't like doesn't mean they were bamboozled, which is the word you like to use. It's not logical. You would have to go to voters and say, do you regret how you voted? Like, that would be an indication of being bamboozled. But I don't see that there's.
I would say that if you poll the majority of North Dakotans, and I don't have the money to find the survey, but I have a feeling that if we asked them what they voted for with term limits, they would think they voted for term limits for Congress. So yes, I think they absolutely get bamboozled. I think sometimes they have really no idea what they're voting for.
Well, I think at some level, it was very clearly stated that it was for the legislature and the governor. And I think I think if someone is just unwilling to read, that's a whole other issue.
Yeah, I think the point I've been making.
I don't think that they thought they were voting it for Congress. I thought that they felt that way for Congress, and they're like, "What? Why not here as well?" I mean, I don't think people, and I also think people's memories are flawed. They could have known in that moment what they're voting for, and in retrospect, and say, "Was it for Congress?" I think people are capable of knowing how they feel at a given point in time, and there are just barriers to them getting access to that. I think, you know, what Chad has been saying is really important. And I think also, you know, respectfully, I will say that there are people who have age-related limitations with technology. There are people with, you know, cognitive issues where they do know how they stand on issues, but navigating the complexity of bureaucracy is inaccessible to them. There are people who are just obviously so mentally overwhelmed. I mean, mental taxation is real. You only have so much cognitive resource to go on. And so I think we meet people where they're at. We realize these things are hard to do. And I think, you know, Chad brought up that legislators can act like they're not happy to see you. That is very real. I mean, the condescension, even contempt. I have been received with contempt. That was the energy I got from a legislator. Oh, actually more than one when I think of all the years that have passed. And like, you know, it's really demoralizing and uncomfortable. And so I think we have a lot of work to do on making that a better experience for citizens and just working on civic education. I'm not convinced that making direct democracy harder is the solution. There's so much more we can do for educating our citizens and bringing them into the fold and getting engaged.
So, Ellie, I will be honest, and I said this earlier, that I've sort of moved a little bit on this issue. I used to be a hell no, don't change anything in the process. But I'm getting frustrated by the amount of things that I'm seeing on the ballot that Measure 4 is the perfect example, but there's other things as well, that I'm moving towards a place where I do want maybe a little bit more difficult to change the Constitution. I don't think this is the answer. But I would love to see, and I would like to know if the opponents of this thing are having conversations about what is a palatable alternative to Measure 2, because it does feel like we turn these measures, and we have them every 2 years, turn into a debate like we're just having. either direct democracy is good or direct democracy is bad. It's either this, sort of thing we should never touch or a thing that we can't trust the people to do right. How do we get to a place where we're not going to have a measure like this on the ballot every 2 years moving forward?
Democracy is hard, and it is not this perfect, warm, fuzzy, constant existence. And I honestly think that, candidate elections are tumultuous. There's competition. There's votes have to be recounted. There are recall elections. I think democracy being a bit messy just comes with the territory. And I'm genuinely not bothered by these measures making it to our ballots. I think the process is working. However, I would evaluate any proposal to adjust the process on its own and on its own merit. And so I think that more education and information on the measures so that bad measures can just fail would help. I think that if there's some guardrails that are in place that are fair and equitable with candidate elections, I'm receptive to it. I don't really think it's the job of the opposition to measure to suggest alternatives if we're not actually seeing things particularly broken. However, we're certainly receptive to hearing anything out, and especially, not just from elites, but from ordinary people. If there are concerns they have, let's talk about it and let's foster more engagement on these issues.
I mean, it doesn't sound very open because every time one of these proposals comes up, it's the same verbiage. You're an elitist, you're condescending, you're disrespectful to the people. How dare you do this? That doesn't sound very open. I mean, it seems like we're in a position. Jana Myrdal talked about this. She said there's a lot of people in the legislature. Her proposal was watered down a great deal, and there were a lot of people in the legislature who perceive a problem but were afraid to put their name to it because they didn't want to be accused of being elitists and everything else. I don't think serving in the legislature makes you an elitist automatically. I don't think former Senator Erin Oban was an elitist. I think she was a public servant who did her best in that office. So, Chad's shrugging. He's joking.
And she votes no on these resolutions.
Sure, I'm sure she does. That's not my point. The point is, I really don't like this because you honestly, in some ways, you kind of reminding me of like Donald Trump, right? Like it's like you either agree with me or you're one of these elitists, these terrible people. I can't imitate him, but I don't like that rhetoric. Like I don't have a problem with these proposals, right? I think they're dumb, and I'm going to say they're dumb. When they get put on the ballot, Measure 4 is dumb. I think it's a terrible idea. I wish we weren't voting on it. I wish that North Dakota's business community and all the other interests in the state and our teachers and everything else didn't have to put together an enormous amount of money to fight off these bad ideas, because if nobody makes the negative argument for them, they might just pass by default. That scares me. And I don't think it's elitist of me to say there's a problem with this process. So I would ask you, Ellie, if you really want to be open-minded, maybe try to understand that the people who are disagreeing with you are not necessarily elitist scumbags who hate the voters.
Well, I'm not saying anybody's a scumbag, okay, but I think that I think one issue that is worth acknowledging and exploring is the fact that ballot measures often come from inertia or as a response to inertia in the legislature. And I think that if we can address that head on, like frankly, and understand that, maybe more proactivity and collaboration with ordinary citizens on the part of the legislature would keep some of these measures from coming into existence. So, I'm not voting for the annihilation of property taxes, but I will admit that it does stem in part from a frustration of growing property taxes, and that's why some people are attracted to the measure. And there, has been inadequate action on the part of the legislature for that. Same thing with cannabis measures, which obviously, most of them haven't attempted to be constitutional in nature. But I think that in some ways, it just legislature needs to wake up to these issues, and it maybe sometimes just accept that the polity, the people are not where they would love them to be, but they are there to represent interests. And so I think that, and it seems like sometimes the legislature gets it and sometimes folks there don't. And so understanding that they are somewhat causing these outcomes is, I think, an important thing.
If the legislature is so out of touch with the people, why do they get reelected all the time?
Well, there are political scientists who study party ID and how powerful it really is. And, there's the social psychological mechanisms of in-group identity. And at some point, it's actually a really deeply political psychological thing, which has to be a whole other discussion, a very fun rabbit hole, admittedly. But it's complicated. People really identify with the party and they'll go for it, and they'll ignore the nuance between, maybe they won't pay attention at the primary and they won't look at the difference between folks there. I think party identity is sometimes quite unhelpful.
I don't know. I feel like you let the voters off the hook when it comes to electoral politics, or you let them off the hook for initiated measures, or I don't know. It seems like there's a double standard. It's like the voters are brilliant and wise when it comes to initiated measures, but they don't know what they're doing when it comes to electing people. That doesn't pass the smell test for me.
I don't know that they're brilliant and wise so much, although sometimes they are wise, but I think it's more that it's just a matter of rights and the Constitution. Basically, all the power comes from the people. Whether we like it or not, that's actually the source of legitimacy of government. And so meeting people where they're at, flaws and all, strengths and weaknesses, is just what we do in this kind of society. And we just don't have to love everything about it. I think sometimes democracy feels inconvenient to some of us, but the alternatives are ugly and alienating. And I don't want to live in a state that has, leans more representative than democratic or direct democratic as we currently do. I would really miss this kind of energy if I lived somewhere else. And so I think just because people have room to grow and there's room for improvement doesn't mean that we should break something. I think we can think thoughtfully. I think if we really respect that people are the source of power, we will meet them where they're at, and we will educate them more, and we will consider governance in a more serious light.
I have talked a lot during this, so I'll let Chad have that. And I came at you pretty. I came at you pretty hard, Ellie, and I appreciate you taking my questions. I am really trying, because I what I view sometimes is a bias for this process. I want to balance it, and I do want people to engage. I don't know that automatically has to mean direct democracy. I don't mean that saying having these processes available can be a bad idea. The process of how we go about governing ourselves matters a lot, and not every process is created equal. So I really want to push back on the idea. I think it's atrocious. I think we should be able to have these debates and have reasonable, and I think Measure 2 is a reasonable proposal, even though I don't necessarily think it's the right proposal and I'm not going to vote for it. I think we should be able to have these debates without it being a choice between either we respect the power of the people or we don't. I don't think it's that. We can find a middle ground here.
Yeah, and so Ellie, just a couple thoughts at the end. I think your point about Measure 4 and property taxes coming from a frustration from the citizens and the legislature is a super legitimate one. And so I think thinking about this process and how are voters supposed to express that frustration when the legislature isn't moving, I think is something that folks should think about. But the other thing I think about with both this measure and Measure 4 is property taxes are a problem. We can agree on that. That doesn't mean Measure 4 is the right solution. We can agree that maybe the constitutional process is not perfect. Maybe not agree on that 100%. That doesn't mean Measure 2 is the right solution to it, right? I think that there's some things that I would feel comfortable supporting that would change the process and make it a little bit more difficult. I don't know how you keep out-of-state money, and I think I think that Measure 2 actually empowers out-of-state big money more than the current system does by making it more difficult.
I think that's fair. Yeah.
So anyway, I think it's a good conversation for us to have. I wish we weren't having it every 2 years, but I think that voters need to be thinking about this not as just sort of, I like the system, I hate the system, yes or no on Measure 2, but really looking at the policy that's before us.
And I actually think we should talk about it more often, just not under the gun like this. I think that if it was a part of our civic discussion, what do people want? How do they want it to function? And that there was that kind of understanding being built and the feedback being received, and town halls during not election years, legislators actually going out and doing more on this issue and other issues. I think that it's not the frequency of the conversation that it is the problem. it's still under the gun.
They do that. Like during the legislative session, while they're making policy, Minot's lawmakers come home every week and hold a Saturday town hall session that is not very well attended. It's open to the public. And I think that's maybe a frustration in all of this, is I don't think it's that complicated to engage with the legislature. I really don't. I think if you want to put the time into it, you can, and you can achieve that knowledge. I think a lot of people just don't. And I get it. And it's my job, and I understand maybe I have a distorted view of it. But if you really want to engage on an issue, you can. There's not a lot of obstacles. And I don't know how to, in North Dakota, I don't know how we make it any easier.
I think the idea, like, yes, if you pick one pet issue to focus on a legislative session, it's one thing. But when there's a ton of really important things going on, it is really overwhelming. And like, even though I am up to the task in some ways, I have a job that is separate from these endeavors. And there were certain challenges going on personally. It made it super hard to keep up. I just actually checked out for a while because I just couldn't manage it. And so people might find it surprising to think that someone like me is so interested in these things wasn't able to keep up. I think that, you have one disruption to your life, one crisis just emerges in your family, and you're out for all legislative session, and it's just a few months. I think it's wonderful if Minot legislators hold town halls, but what I've heard from people who've lived here for a while is that in a variety of communities, town halls are less and less frequent. And I'm not invited to too many with legislators. I don't see too many being posted. There may be an information problem. Facebook algorithm is terrible, and maybe people aren't reading the local newspaper. And so maybe there's a messaging problem, but I'm just not experiencing that level of outreach. And, maybe others can learn from Minot legislators in that regard.
Yeah, I also think it's intimidating, Rob. I think it's easy for like you and I mean, my dad was a legislator. My wife was a legislator. I'm not intimidated to talk to a legislator, right? I mean, but I think it can be intimidating when I talk to people and say, hey, would you go and testify on this bill? They're like, oh my God, I'm not smart enough to do that. I don't know all the things. What if they ask me all these questions, whatever? So I think it can be intimidating.
But you got to remember what my trajectory was. I mean, I wasn't always, had a huge political audience across the state. There was a time when I was a 20-something blogger at a time where nobody had heard of blogs, and I had to teach myself. I didn't go to journalism school. I had that experience. I did it. I put in the work.
Rob,
And also, but also, like, you got to remember, most of the time I was doing that, I also had a day job. I would work all day and come home and work on this stuff at night. I had kids. I had to feed, I had a lawn to mow, I had dishes to do, I had a house to clean. I was a single dad for a lot of it, and I did it. So I chafe a little bit at the idea that it's not possible. I did it. Other people can do it.
It is possible, but that doesn't mean it's easy.
And I'm open to the ideas of making it easier, too. I'm not saying we can't improve.
I can read. Rob, I think you're very good at time management. I can just tell by the amount of like writing you pump out every day. And the thing is, I think sometimes we just need to
I don't sleep. I don't sleep. That's part of it. And I don't recommend that as a strategy, by the way.
Average people actually have to sleep, or their brains just don't function, or they get sick. Or I just think sometimes we're unintentionally elitist because we have certain capacities that other people don't have, and it doesn't mean they should be any less capable of self-governance. That's what I mean when I say we meet people where we're at. And, I used to be like a powerhouse workhorse too. And then a little bit of aging crept in, and I'm just not as capable as much as I used to be, and it is what it is. And I'm finding myself more like an average person in a lot of ways. And it's just hard to keep up when you just don't have all that going for you.
I do think one thing that I do want to focus on as we, or just tell people, because I think people listening to this might say, well, I feel overwhelmed. How am I going to track for all this stuff? This is the role that organizations like associations and even lobbying groups, they get a terrible name and they're called special interests and everything. But if you care about gun rights, the NRA does a pretty good job of tracking this stuff to you. And if you engage with them, they will send you updates. If you care about education issues and you're a teacher joining a group like North Dakota United, they track this stuff. They update you. They take your temperature. They express if you agree with their group. And there's all sorts of, if you're pro-life, if you're pro-choice, if you're whatever your particular issue is, there's lots of groups out there that's part of why they exist, is to make that public engagement. It's like we have this group of like-minded people, and we're going to represent their views in this process. That's why they exist. And it's a good reason why they exist. And and I'm telling people that is one way to become overwhelmed. Engage with those groups. Whatever groups fit how you see the world, engage with them, because that's part of why they're there. We got to put a pin in this. Ellie, thank you so much for coming on and letting me.
Thank you, Ellie. This was fun.
And being confrontational with me about it. This is obviously something I'm super passionate about, but I really appreciate you coming on.
No problem.
That's it for today on Plain Talk, the voice of North Dakota politics. Plain Talk is a production of Forum Communications Company. Got a question, comment, or suggestion? Send me an email at rport@forumcom.com. That's forumcom with 2 M's.com. If you haven't subscribed to Plain Talk yet, you can find us on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. For those of you who are already hooked, give us a rating or review. And don't forget to share or tell a friend. Special thanks to my co-host Chad Oban, and from myself and everyone at Plain Talk, thanks for listening.
Not to go all Kamala Harris on you,